So, one of the things most argued about in the heathen community, which is saying a lot, is Yule. So, I'm going to attempt probably a series of, various 10-minute videos explaining different aspects of different traditions, etc. This, of course, will be as I have either experienced them or as I have learned them, whether from reading or interacting with other heathens. The big question for new people is, when does it start? Which is one of the major arguments about Yule. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there are two historically applicable and referenced ways in which it starts. The older version appears to be a 3-day celebration taking place on the first full moon after the solstice. However, in the saga of Hakon the Good, we see that he moves the celebration to the solstice, and a lot of people do that. Even in non-heathen circles, the solstice has a tendency to be called Yule. Now, this move from the Christian king Hakon was seemingly accepted by the pagans and was done to, synchronize the timing of the celebrations of the community as a whole, at this point split between Norse pagan and Christianity. Now, Snorri specifically writes that Hakon basically went to all of the ale makers and said, make as much ale as you can for the celebration. When it runs out, the celebration ends, and that happened to be 12 days. Though I do find it interesting that both the timing and the amount of days is cohabitated with the Christian celebration of the Epiphany. So I'm somewhat inclined to believe that the story about Hakon specifically going to the ale makers is a dramatization on Snorri's part. Now, the 3-day celebration is certainly older, but we do see modern heathens incorporate both of these historical methods of celebrating Yule, and they're both honestly as valid as any other. To be overly honest, my kindred celebrates Yule whenever we can get the most members out of work at the same time. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the 12-day celebration of Yule, as that was the way that it was explained to me when I was a wee youngling heathen. So the first night, which is on the night of the solstice, so on the longest night of the year, is Mother's Night, and the night after that, as I was taught, is Father's Night. Father's Night also being the night that the Wild Hunt does its stuff. I'm incorporating these two nights in the same explanation because it's effectively going to be the same thing with the obvious deviations. Mother's Night is about respecting your living and deceased female ancestors. Father's Night, your living and deceased male ancestors. Now, especially nowadays, a lot of topics come up, especially if, you don't have good relations with your mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, if they are living. And I'll be honest, that is a whole thing. Everyone is going to have their personal beliefs about what they are willing to do in relation to parents or grandparents that they no longer have contact with, have traumatized them, etc. Now, I personally believe and have gone through honoring and respecting ancestors that I don't agree with on a variety of things, but still keeping my distance. I'm still here because of them. They still did accomplishments. However, I can still keep my distance while still respecting they are still my ancestors, even if that particular relationship, whether alive or deceased, is... Now, the term for female ancestors is generally easy. It is the Disir, which is a term that I'm sure a lot of heathens have come up a lot. And that will be the focus of the first night, Mother's Night. It is all of your female ancestors. Now, a lot of beings kind of get grouped up in Disir, but I think most of them are also good for honoring this night. Now, while the title All-Mother is a new phenomenon, Frigg being the queen of the gods and the goddess heavily associated with motherhood, fertility in her own right, and a bunch of other things is good for it. I've seen a lot of people do Freya, however, that's going to be a later night as well. If you want to do it, that's fine. The Norns are sometimes considered Disir, but the main focus is the female ancestors of your line. So, yeah, that's, your mother, both of your grandmothers, etc. And again, for the second night, it's going to be roughly the same thing. However, the term for male ancestors is debated if there even is one. Specifically, the Troth and a bunch of other organizations that kind of seem to be going off the same thing will say that men's male ancestors are called Alfar if there is no qualifications to the term. What they mean by qualifications is that Alfar is kind of the name just kind of generally given to a certain type of supernatural being that didn't seem to have a gender in a lot of references. However, there is seemingly specifically the male reference towards male ancestors being called Alfar. Again, this is one of the many things that's heavily debated. There is an argument to be made that perhaps Alfar is the name of the group and therefore is the default name for just male, and Disir is the, female equivalent for that. So, like, Disir are Alfar. But see, me saying it makes it complicated, and I don't know if it's specifically just, removed from the culture of the language, a language issue, because I'll admit, not really an Old Norse expert, or if this is a phenomenon that the Troth just kind of latched onto and is like, this makes enough sense. If anyone is aware of other terms, be free to let me know. But as I said, it's 2 nights honoring your ancestors, and it's pretty simple. The third night is Mana's night, the night of reverence to the moon. Keeping in mind that, solar lunar calendars were a thing, as well as the moon is the light in the darkness. Many humans, even Nordic people, were indeed very scared of the dark for a long period of time, and I would even argue that even now, if you live in big cities, we don't quite still have a mastery over it. Now, not to mention that a lot of Yule focuses are on Ragnarok, and if the moon, for whatever reason, is gone, that's a bad sign. Day 4 is the night of Froya and Froya, more commonly known as Freyr and Freya, the Vanir twins of fertility. Very much so, the human physical aspects of fertility. And as Froya is the goddess of witchcraft, innately it is the night of witches. Day 5 is the Feast of Frith, specifically being a feast day for the community, specifically the heathen community that you are a part of. And keeping in mind that especially historic ones, you were either in a large gathering, such as the Yule celebrations in Norway, or you were celebrating with people that you were sharing the winter barn with. It's a feast for the community, letting the community know both from an individual level to individual, as well as the community itself recognizing individuals. It's usually done at this feast. Eat, play games, all of that. Day 6 tends to be pretty heavy as it is Yr's night, and Yr is the goddess of healing. This can go to mental, physical, spiritual healing, emotional healing. And while, yes, some of these would be relatively modern concepts, even in the old days, it can get pretty heavy. Both making sure that everyone is okay in those aspects, and the settling of any quarrels peacefully. And this is hopefully helped by the previous night's festivities with everyone. So after Ir's night is Thor's night. Now, Thor has a tendency to come up in celebrations such as this anyway, but especially as the guardian of Midgard and a lot of the kind of Ragnarok implications of Yule. So the seventh night has a tendency to both be extremely celebratory and really somber. Thor is a god fairly established to really like partying, feasting, and drinking. But he also has his role in protecting us, and that includes during Fimbulwinter, which, the longest night of the year is kind of supposed to be like, if it's happening, it's going to happen roughly around this time. And, of course, what happens to Thor during Ragnarok. But until that point, just in case it is Fimbulwinter, offerings to Thor, fairly necessary. Now, the eighth day, as I was taught, is the night dedicated to Skadi and Ullr. Gods who aren't necessarily grouped together in myths a lot, as far as I know, but have very similar spheres of influence. They're both Skadi and Ullr are both gods heavily associated with winter and hunting, and therefore embody a lot of the things of, regardless of whether it's just a normal winter or Fimbulwinter, what you need to do to survive such a winter. And honestly, I do think it's really interesting to see both of these gods celebrated together in such a fashion, because there's not a lot of evidence that they're even, acknowledgeable of each other, aside from they have similar spheres of influence. There is some fan fiction that after the marriage with Njord, goes haywire, Skadi and Ullr get together, and I've seen people try to peddle that as fact, but I have never seen that in actual writings. But I get why that fan fiction exists. And day 9 is the coming of the Yule Father, Odin's night. This, in, the contemporary heathenism that does the whole 12-day celebration, is the gift-giving day. Day 10 is Suna's night, the night of the sun. Celebrating that roughly about now, the days are going to start getting longer. And obviously all of the important and obvious things that the sun represents, especially to a community that is going to be heavily based on farming and just in general, just not being in the dark. The days getting longer means that the Fimbulwinter isn't coming, so that means Ragnarok isn't happening. So again, joyous day. Day 11 is the Night of the Valkyries. This has a tendency to be used as both honoring the Valkyries as a, whole purpose that they do, which is carrying people to the various afterlives, most often associated with carrying worthy warriors to Valhalla, and those who are carried by them. In the way that I've seen this done, it tends to be the people of the community that people believe are worthy of the Valkyries' attention having passed are recognized on this night, and the Valkyries are thanked for their service to this individual. Slight side note, Valkyries are one of those other beings that get kind of lumped in with Disir. As I said, Disir is a lot of really vague terms used in Norse paganism, especially from the historical writing. And day 12 is the Oath Night. Now, obviously, as everyone knows, in Norse paganism, the making of an oath is among the most sacred things you can do, to the point of there are whole historic and modern laws about it. Obviously, the modern laws are more within community by community base, but the fact that those are important enough that we take them seriously, this is how it's done, is a statement of the modern culture. Now, obviously, in the old days, oaths were generally limited to things that were swearing fealty to someone or, very similar high promises, which is not necessarily something that we replicate, at least in the exact same way. But obviously, The taking of oaths in a variety of circumstances, still really important now. I know people that have more or less gotten engaged on this night. People get sworn into kindreds or groups or sworn into positions on this night. I always got the feeling it's like, all right, we had fun now. Now we need to get back to paperwork kind of day. And some people may be wondering why I didn't really talk about the Wild Hunt when I was talking about day 2, because I said that Father's Night is the night that the Wild Hunt does its thing. And the simple answer to that is that the main thing you do when the Wild Hunt is happening is stay in your house. You do not want to be outside at the same time that the Wild Hunt is. There are many legends and even some modern happenings of anything that is presumably in the way of the Wild Hunt, whether it's people, livestock, full on houses, are utterly destroyed. And plus, it's the Wild Hunt. Supernatural beings are on a hunt. Do you really want to be seen by someone in that kind of mindset? Or at least that's the way that, from the Norse pagan perspective, I was taught to think about it. Which isn't to say that I haven't seen other variations. I have seen people at the very least leave out offerings because, Odin or, a possibility of other gods lead the Wild Hunt. Obviously, as a Norse Gael pagan myself, the combination of Norse and Irish things and the Irish Wild Hunt is a thing. I've seen a lot of people believe that it's like any ancestor who really enjoyed hunting and was good at it has a chance to be in the Wild Hunt. So I have seen some people that, like, during this day will more or less, like, petition for the right of their ancestors to be in the Wild Hunt on both the Norse pagan and Irish pagan perspective. Yeah, but for the most part, the Wild Hunt portion of the supernatural things happening tonight is to be avoided. Now, I've always thought that, like, the 12 nights was a really cool thing. I think it would be really hard to plan if, like, you weren't in a commune or something, or y'all didn't just happen to work together or something. Because, like, getting your entire kindred together for 12 nights in a row seems very difficult. And I say this as the Gothi of my kindred, and even planning even something for a couple hours takes a lot out of you, so I can't imagine 12 days of this. Don't get me wrong, I love my kindred and we always manage to have fun. Just something happens. I think we're just all different types of organized and obviously different ways and everything, so yeah. And aside from that, a lot of people don't like the 12 nights because, it's newer, it's Christian influenced, which I get. But at the same time, from all writings that I've ever found, is that the pagans accepted this move. I also kind of like it because, as I mentioned before, a lot of the themes of Yule kind of, go towards a little bit of that, like, it's Fimbulwinter. It's almost the new year. So if Ragnarok is happening, it's now. So the fact that it starts on that this version of the celebration starts on the longest night, I do think can have a lot of spiritual influence. I don't think it's a bad choice in any way. I don't necessarily consider that just because something is older that it's more valid or any less valid. I do think a lot of people kind of get stuck up on this is older so it's more correct, which I think is a weird way to think about something because I want you to think about anything else and see if that's the case. But ultimately, it's a celebration. I just, I think the nights are kind of cool and I think they're structured in a way that it can be done with enough planning and, yeah, if it needs to be synchronized, such as in the case of a dual faith household, it's real easy to do. And all of the nights have their particular significance and focus, and you can do a lot with all of the options. And I think you can do a lot with it whether you have a kindred or you're a solitary practitioner. I say kindreds a lot because that's my most recent experience, and that's kind of the structure in which this is supposed to take place. But solitary practitioners have the right to be festive as well. I'll have more Yule videos on the way as time allows, and thank you for watching. So, historic Yule before Hakan the Good is a matter of a lot of research that's mostly archaeology, as there are very few written records of the pre Hakonian Yule. What is known about it is that it was the first full moon after the new moon after the solstice. So, usually, sometime in January, a little around the time of what we might call in modern days our midwinter celebrations, at least for those of us in the northern hemisphere. So, one thing to keep in mind is that we are talking about medieval and pre medieval conceptions of the full moon. So, we're looking at the full moon lasting 3 days instead of what we know about it is that the moon is actually waxing and waning for the first and third day. Mostly because with your naked eye, the moon is basically going to be full for those 3 days. And in all actuality, the moon is only like full for like 20 ish minutes. Now, for the 3 day celebration, we start on the full moon because Yule was historically more of a season than necessarily a like particular. I mean, I guess it was a festival, but it wasn't like a holiday. We were celebrating the start of the season. And full moons are a good day to start celebrations and festivals for everything for a lot of reasons. Obviously, there's like magical and supernatural implications of full moons, but also during this time at night, full moon is when you're going to have the most amount of natural light at night. It also being good to note that during this time, calendars were at least partially on a lunar cycle. It's somewhat debated on whether it was a lunar or solar lunar calendar, but yeah, lunar cycles obviously being heavily important, and lunar cycles last about, I believe it's like 29.5 days. So, for the most part, you have a very calculated way of going about your calendar. So, it is very different than the Gregorian calendar that we're under today. And while there is still some overlap with that point 0.5, it only happened every, I believe it's like 8 years during a lunar cycle. They would add a month instead of our current Gregorian system of adding and subtracting days. It's highly theorized that there were other reasons for doing it, on this particular full moon. Unfortunately, as with a lot of things, exact stories or reasonings may very well be lost to us if they existed. But how they celebrated was indeed written down. There is a 5th century sermon that has been translated by a man named Caesarius of Arles. I'm probably mispronouncing that or slightly misremembering, of quotes of a disgraceful tradition of men dressing up like old hags and stags. Further translation of the work talks about men taking the form of animals in general, wearing the skin of sheep, and just in general being merry while having very masquerade like tendencies. Describing the events that they would stake the heads of animals, as well as just be in a state as if they took the form of the animal they're wearing. More than likely, this is describing just people dressing up as animals and having fun while drunk. Other implications are certainly there, though not extensively reported, along with various traditions of something called a reindeer dance. Effectively, they would dance around with the heads of reindeer on pikes, or rather sticks, and there would be noise of, I believe it's 6 or 9 men dancing around, making music with the antlers of said reindeer. Now, this is actually a fairly wide tradition in a lot of cases, at least within the dance itself, and there are reportings of the rain dance happening in, relatively early Viking invasion England. So, as there are no reindeer in England, at least since the Ice Age that I'm aware of, It is believed that the antlers were indeed an import from Scandinavia. Emperor Constantine the Seventh of the Eastern Roman Empire, in his book, The Book of Ceremonies, seems to denote a ceremony done by Goths, in which the various men will stand in two circles, dressed in furs, and will hold sticks and shields, and will cling them together. And the book writes, "Tool, tool." And they will shout this while dancing in a circle. It is believed that the word tool here is a scribal error of the word Yule, and that the men doing this are possibly of the Varangian Guard. In Iceland, there seems to be a tradition called the Finngelkin, which I'm probably mispronouncing, which is a figure that showed up with two shield maidens or Valkyries, while effectively dressed in a wooden head of a bull or other animal, and was draped in a bunch of cloth, and the Finngelkin, which was seen to be as a man cross-dressing as a beast, and therefore was half man, half beast, would generally be humorously, at least in an attempt to be so, rowdy, such as, getting its horns under women's skirts, and a bunch of other drunken acts, until it was driven away, and this seemed to have been a part of the proceedings. This effectively being a game that was played, and there were many games with many people with animal-like aspects to them. There are also being reports that during these games there would be a man who played a similar game, except he was dressed up as a grotesque giantess, so effectively he'd be wearing stilts in a dress, have his own grotesque headpiece to reflect the giantess, and would also be acting fairly, belligerent and drunkenly until driven away. And specifically during the giantess game, it's believed that effectively the people around him, were having fun, but there would be mocking and insulting songs sung at the giantess. So we're definitely getting a theme of merriment and games, and perhaps a little bit of, tomfoolery in the way of, boys will be boys, this is kind of where we let them. But it is something that the whole community is consenting to be a part of. Now, obviously, like the 12-day cycle that I talked about before, in the 3-day celebration of Yule, it was very important for feast, gift giving, general merriment, oath taking. But there was also a heavy implication that it was during these days specifically that the dead could haunt the earth again. And depending on the source, the region, and a bunch of other factors, kinda seem to depend on how friendly the dead were. In the older 3-day celebration, it was basically now that the wild hunt was happening, among other hauntings that could take place. It is in these older traditions where I talked about before, you do not want to be around the wild hunt, as specifically you could be carried away, and therefore, you are now a part of the wild hunt and no longer of the world of the living, or even if you saw it, it was an omen of your own passing coming in the year. Now, regardless of whether these wights were friendly or not, and in a lot of cases not, it was this happening, the coming of the dead, that renewed the fields. This was very much the fertility festival of the land in of itself, as the whites coming back, their presence innately spiritually helped the fields around them. So we see very much the agricultural focus of the society and the festival in midwinter. As I stated before, feasting would be happening, and so there would be sacrifices. And these sacrifices tended to be, a lot of the recorded ones are obviously cows, but also horses, which have a very Odinistic connection to them. So from the sources I'm able to gather, it would appear that the 3-day Yule is heavily focused on drunken masquerading. and honoring the ancestors and the land.